I never stop thinking about Rome. Please help me. Rome. Germany. At one point, they would become one and the same. You know, in a way. But not during the times of ancient Rome. Or at least, Rome at its height. There were a lot of Germans in Rome near the end there. So here's an idea. What if somehow, Rome hadn't just stopped at the Rhine? What if they went further? What if they, say, conquered Germany, or Germania, the part of this that the Romans called Germania? Yeah, it does sound pretty insane. Just like Germany winning World War I or II, the conquest of Germania and the preservation of Rome are pretty high on the improbable alt scenarios tier list. I've sacrificed a good amount of my sanity to Jupiter to justify this video, which will hopefully give a realistic and original take on yet another unsolvable alternate problem. So, let's lay down the groundworks for one of my, more ambitious takes. Taking Germania is difficult, but you know what's even more of a hassle? Talking about history on YouTube. Try to do that, Tiberius. Sometimes even mentioning another topic might demonetize your video. That's not really helpful when you have a lot of topics to talk about. Anything might be a landmine. If history creators can't talk about what they want, how can history enthusiasts get what they want? Well, there's at least one solution. Entirely independent of YouTube. Armchair History TV, the sponsor of today's video. A streaming site built by history content creators for history content. Videos that talk about conflict or topics too sensitive to YouTube don't need to worry about all that hard work going to waste. The site has over 250 videos in their library, even a familiar one of mine. Not to mention exclusive new content every week, like the 45-minute cinematic documentary about the rise and fall of ISIS. So what are you waiting for? Help support creators and history content online by signing up for Armchair History TV, using the code FREEHISTORY for 100% off your first month. Alright, back to Rome. The year is 27 BC. Augustus just set a new precedent for a ruler by building the foundations of the empire. Pax Romana had risen from the ashes of the old republic. He was feeling pretty confident. The Principates were focused on consolidation and reform, but several regions were, crossing his mind at the periphery of the empire. Among them was the sparsely populated, forested region east of the Rhine River. Exactly 50 years after Caesar dipped his toe and ran off, the governor of Gaul was assaulted by the Germanic tribes who crossed the river and vanquished a legion, capturing a standard. In response, Augustus sent in his stepson, Drusus, on a quest to recover the eagle. Drusus got lost in the side quest part of the Germania expansion pack, and ended up focusing his attention on slaughtering and subjugating as many tribes as possible, for back-to-back campaigns between 12 and 9 BC. After doing all of that, he fell off his horse on his way back home. He succumbed to gangrene and died. What a way to go. The Roman general and his 7 legions built 50 bases along the Rhine River. They dug canals which allowed the fleet to sail along the North Sea and surprise his enemies. The Germanic tribes were just outgunned, figuratively, and outmatched by the most sophisticated, well-supplied, well-armed, and well-trained army up to that point. Several chieftains just bent the knee, supplied the Romans with tribute, and their youngest sons, who were now to be raised in Rome. One of those boys was the 10-year-old Arminius, who, alongside his brother, adopted the Latin language and its customs. Nobody knew it at the time, but this young boy was about to be a major headache for the Romans. And when I mean a headache, I mean he wiped out 3 legions. When theorizing about some alternate world where Rome conquered Germania, there's 2 questions that might come to everyone's mind. 1, could Rome ever conquer Germania? Well, let's just answer that question now. Yeah, because in our timeline they kind of did. Or at least, they occupied it, like half of it. Depends on your definition of Germania too, I guess. But my point is, for a time, Rome actually went beyond the Rhine River and held territory within Germania. I'm not kidding. The borders of the empire in 6 BC looked like this. Sure, they didn't have complex cities like that in Gaul, but the local tribes still paid tribute, they still bent the knee. Roman soldiers walked and patrolled this land. So second question, why would Rome want to conquer Germania? For all they saw, it was just an endless dark forest. What incentive was there to conquer it? Trust me, we'll get to that question later. As for now, all you need to know is that this border on the Rhine was not always destined to be. It was from the actions of a few, and of many, that led this to be set in stone. Not to be outdone by his brother, Emperor Tiberius showed that he was a worthy successor to Augustus by coordinating a massive invasion of the Marcomanni tribe. The war machine was unstoppable, and under the heir's leadership, it took 6 years for the Germanic Celts in the west to be completely obliterated. Things for Rome were looking up, but like any conflict involving Germany, our story here has to take a detour because of the Balkans. Rome had focused a lot on their Germanic frontier, so much so that a bunch of Illyrian chieftains in what was then called Pannonia had the bright idea to rebel. This was a full-scale revolt. I say revolt, but don't underestimate it. This was an army of 200,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry. Tiberius was forced to postpone his campaign in order to deal with all of that. Curiously, his army of over a dozen legions featured none other than Arminius himself, now a well-trained young man. There, in the forested hills of the Balkans, Arminius would gain experience and the trust of his Roman superiors, learning the Roman tactics from within. In his absence, Publius Verus was made the first official governor of the Germania province, a man known for his harsh taxation and even harsher punishments after he crucified 2,000 Jews in Jerusalem. Rome wasn't built in a day. It took the efforts of millions, led by dozens of incredible leaders. And in that long line of commanders going through generations, Verus stood out as one of the dumbest. Not even of his day, arguably of all time. Long story short, despite multiple glaring warnings, he marched 3 entire legions into the thick of the Germanic forests. Verus trusted the locals at their word to house some of his men. Verus trusted good old Arminius, who had reports of a German rebellion. They only had to go deeper into the woods to find it. Probably not the smartest move by Verus. When the Romans realized what was going on, it was too late. And now 3 legions found themselves in the middle of the woods, surrounded by German warriors. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest would read like a comedy if it wasn't so horrific. Arminius never forgot what the Romans did. He had been plotting, uniting the tribes under the Romans' nose, and now he would make them bleed. 20,000 were dead. 3 whole legions swallowed up. Rome was no stranger to insurmountable losses, or ambushes, or rebellious chieftains. 20,000 was really just a drop in the bucket, even by the Republic standards. Slaves, Hannibal, Parthians, all managed to put dirt in the Roman eye. But this was different. First, this was the first major defeat of the Empire, the first stain on the pristine Augustan record. From the Emperor's perspective, he needed to send a message before other chieftains, or worse, Roman generals, got any ideas. Secondly, this humiliating defeat was the result of treachery. Treachery and ambush was not warfare to the Romans, it was cowardice. For centuries, Rome's guide to warfare was really just meeting up on a fair battlefield under the watchful gaze of the gods and seeing who wins. That's why they really didn't like the Parthians either. Damn archers on horses, get back here. Arminius played a dangerous gamble, and it paid off, but doing so broke any semblance of a hope that Germanic tribes would ever be integrated into the imperial system. But if Germania wouldn't be a part of the empire, it would still, at least, need to be pacified. Rome's version of pacified. What followed next was a series of campaigns under the commander called Germanicus. The Roman revenge was brutal. Marching east of the Rhine again, they systematically eradicated any tribe that played a part in the plot. The following conflict would go on for years, ending only once the Romans finally got the fair fight they wanted. Despite heavy losses on both sides, Rome came out on top. Arminius was defeated and faded from relevancy. Eventually, he was just poisoned by a political rival. Rome never did gain Germania, and that was a sense of pride for later German dynasties. Both Alesia and Teutoburg were romanticized by later medieval dynasties, and the Prussians, all as a glorious resistance against Roman/Latin rule. In the 19th century, the German Empire erected a statue to Arminius in the very same forest where 20,000 Romans lost their lives. He stood there, facing the modern-day Latins. You know, the French. So here's an idea. What if Arminius died? You know, died before he became a headache for Rome. Rome sustained a ton of casualties, putting down the Great Illyrian Revolt. So is it really the craziest idea to just imagine if Arminius was among them? Say he just falls in battle, random arrow, cut by a sword, steps on a landmine, take your pick. Easy enough, but would the death of one man really alter history that much? So much that it leads to the conquest of Germania? Well, prior to the revolt, Emperor Augustus himself planned a campaign with his stepson, aiming to push the Roman frontier to the Elbe River, a goal for which his successor Tiberius was promised 12 legions and a massive fleet. Prior to Teutoburg, it was he who would carry those plans out. But instead, in our timeline, he appointed the brilliant but brutal Germanicus to use those plans for a war of extermination, not conquest. As incompetent as Varus was, he could have probably held the province until Tiberius was done in Pannonia. In this alternate timeline, the year is 11 AD, and an unprepared, divided, and partially bribed Germanic people are beset by an army of 66,000 men. At the helm of this force, the future emperor, who had just maxed out his military, admin, and diplomatic stats. Unlike Germanicus, Tiberius knew when to sheathe the gladius and use Roman gold instead. Diplomacy and money were sometimes more effective than warfare. His brother already landed the first major blow to the clans, and if the history of Rome before and after this conflict is anything to go by, everything west of the Elbe River could potentially be conquered within 2 to 5 years. As crazy as that sounds, the conquests of Greece, Gaul, Egypt, and Britannia were all done in a similar time frame. Just because Germania was a bit farther, it didn't make it impossible to conquer. Terms would be set, tributes and hostages claimed, and a ferocious but fragmented Germanic people could be subjugated by a foe who, in their eyes, was invincible. Remember, there would be no Teutoburg disaster to challenge that fact. Sometimes simply playing off the fears of the conquered and playing their local politics is enough to win. This was a tactic Rome did many times.
Well, that seems anticlimactic.
Well, hang on, Jimmy. I will admit, I sped through the conquest. A little odd considering this video is about Rome conquering Germany, but this is why. Despite all the speculations about how Roman logistics would be strained in the dense forests of Germany, we have a lot of historical precedents to go off of here. And looking at similar situations, I don't think this campaign would be impossible to do. See, in our timeline, logistics were not that much of a problem. Thanks to the Roman navy, command structure, and road system, if they wanted it done, it would get done. Rome got the job done, and that was after Arminius plundered 20,000 sets of armor and weapons. Without this edge, and facing the sneaky diplomacy tactics of Tiberius, Germania, as in the general region, is open for subjugation. Unlike Britannia, which had some semblance of a primitive monarchy with cities and agriculture, Germany had none of those things. Sure, the decentralized and semi-nomadic nature of these Celts, combined with their passion for hardship, abstinence, and keto diet, would give Tiberius a hiccup or two, is just very similar to the Anglo-Zulu War. What is complicated, however, is the integration of said people into an empire that was already on the verge of overextension by the emperor's own admission. Cities and roads would have to be built, farmland developed, people pacified. But Rome could do all of that, provided there was an upside to it. What upside even is there? There's nothing here. Except, there is. Something called the Amber Road. Amber was a luxury resource that the Mediterranean was obsessed with, for some reason. But when there's demand, there is sure to be supply. Unlike gold and gemstones, amber is primarily found in just a couple places on Earth: the Dominican Republic, Myanmar, and the Baltic. The Amber Road from the Baltic dates back to Neolithic times, and the material, who the Romans called electrum, was incredibly precious to them. This same resource was a big reason why the Teutonic Order and Hanseatic League got pretty rich a millennia later. Control over the Elbe River would guarantee a tremendous amount of revenue for the empire. justifying even more resources being sent over to consolidate the territory. Amber was only the first enticement for Rome, however, because then there's Saxony, or the region we today call Saxony. During the Middle Ages, the Saxons were famous for more than just plundering. These were the best smiths in Europe, who developed techniques of pattern welding similar to that of Damascus steel, and one of the greatest thanks to that was the very terrain of Saxony and Bohemia itself. These hills were rich in metal: iron, copper, silver, lead, and zinc, as well as the clay needed to make bloomery furnaces, resources that in our timeline, Rome never discovered. But with just a little bit more time in the region, the moment they uncovered what lay in these hills, they would never want to leave. And also, they'd want to develop them. What I'm talking about here is an alternate settlement of Germany, an alternate foundation for certain parts of Germany at least. Urban populations founded centuries before they did in our timeline. Areas that eventually became Prague and Dresden, which in our timeline had to wait until the 9th and 12th century to become settlements, now become founded by Rome at its peak. In fact, this entire region would receive the same treatment the Romans gave to Cologne, Mainz, Trier, and Aachen, all of which started out as forts. In fact, the frontier cities on the Elbe would have been more developed in this timeline, significantly altering future events in ways I truly can't even predict. Perhaps this region is centers of alternate medieval kingdoms, an alternate cultural center for the Holy Roman Empire. Perhaps this changes the very borders of the Frankish kingdoms themselves. Who's to say? What I can predict though, is that for the time being, this region gets the Gaul treatment. I would hope that it wouldn't get the Gaul treatment, but it most likely would. Last, but certainly not least, we have to talk about the biggest threat to the Romans themselves: trees. Yes, trees. Fun fact, I went to Greece a few years back. One thing that really surprised me was how barren it was. The hills, that is. So many barren hills. Wasn't always like that. Turns out Athenians cut down so many trees to build their fleet, they ended up causing severe levels of deforestation. It was an environmental disaster from which central Greece never really recovered. And this same effect eventually affected the Roman Empire as a whole. But Germany still had trees. A lot of trees. Any strategy gamer will tell you how important lumber is, and the abundance of lumber in these newly conquered lands would go a long way. This new lumber supply would bring in immense production of charcoal, which helped with standard agricultural development, and of course, it would be used in construction of walls and buildings. These are nice new developments for Rome. New resources are always nice, but all of these pros pale in comparison to the cons Rome would avoid in this alternate timeline. Because while conquering Germany might make you imagine an empire stretching its limits, it could perhaps lead to an even more powerful and prosperous imperium, simply by removing potential future enemies. In 12 AD, Augustus recalled Tiberius as he was on his deathbed. Nearly 76 years old, Octavian left the empire in competent hands. But in this alternate timeline, these were the same hands that brought Germania into the fold. Surely integrating the green labyrinth filled with fierce and bitter warriors would be an impossible task, right? Well, once again, we have plenty of precedents. How long did it take for the proud Hellenes to call themselves Roman? Surely it would have taken centuries to pacify the Gauls after what Caesar did to them, right? How about Egypt? A place with customs so different from the Romans, they might as well have come from a different planet. The thing is, when it came to Rome, those things didn't matter. You could say they were incredibly efficient at integration. Gaul was Romanized within a single generation. Egypt became the empire's breadbasket and most lucrative province, and the Greeks were the last Romans to ever fall. It was bloody and brutal, but it worked. Places that were once Rome's greatest enemies, places like Dacia, Britannia, and Anatolia, all eventually became Roman, and even carried on the title once it was gone. So why couldn't Germania have done the same? If anything, it would have been faster. Germania stands out as the least populous and most divided of any of these regions, even without the punitive campaigns. Yeah, logistics would still be rough, but Rome built canals, navies, and navigated the Danube River perfectly.
Tiberius wasn't a great emperor and Caligula was F tier, but the Pax Romana had already developed an unstoppable inertia. If Rome built 30 forts on the Elbe, it's possible that it's just game over. Seriously, I really think Germania could have been Romanized within 100 years. All in all, imagine what happened with the Celtic culture and people in Britannia. Apply it here. The Romans adopted some of the Celtic pantheon. The Celtic language here is wiped out and replaced with Latin, and over a century, dozens of highly developed urban centers spring up on key rivers, and a mini Hadrian's Wall blocks off Denmark. At the end of the 1st century AD, the integration could be pretty much complete, and just in time for the 4 good emperors who ushered in the peak of the Roman Empire.
I know I've been holding back the presumed cons, but allow me to build up some more suspense first, because to crack the fall of Rome, we have to figure out when and why Rome fell in the first place. A lot of people think that these are two very different questions, when in reality, the rise and falls of civilization never happen overnight. Whether it be the bureaucratic Han dynasty, the maritime Venetian Republic, nomadic Mongols, or Onion Ottomans, all of them had a steady rise and fall. We just tend to look at the milestones. The empire was no different, and pointing to years like 410 or 476 doesn't really do much to answer the why. So when and why was it? Was it overexpansion, corruption, invasion, civil war, slavery, Christianity? Nope. I mean, yeah, it was all of those things, but there was one overlooked factor that was kind of bigger than them all. Plagues. The Antonine Plague, which lasted from 165 to 180, ended the Golden Age, and began the process which unraveled the West. Sure, there were moments when Rome bounced back, but consider the parallel to Alexios Komnenos. He also saved the Byzantines from certain demise, and patched them up by calling the Crusades and relying on Italian republics for his trade and navy. For at least a century, the Byzantines were doing good, and then they imploded big time with the Fourth Crusade. That sounds like an event that makes for a good alternate history visual novel. Ultramare. I'm the narrator. It's pretty neat. Where was I? Oh yeah, smallpox. The Antonine Plague struck down Emperor Verus and significantly altered the reign of the incredible Marcus Aurelius. Go read Meditations. Most importantly, this thing wiped out between 1/3 and 1/4 of the entire population. Truly just picture what that meant. Trade networks broke down, economic collapse, Germanic tribes invading in droves, the empire experienced vast labor shortages, and people just began leaving the urban centers in favor of the countryside. All the things that made Rome Rome were falling apart, especially Roman medicine. Roman medicine is the underground savior of the empire, contributing to their supreme logistics and a life expectancy not seen until the 20th century. Roman amputation survival rates were better than those of the American Civil War. My point here is that while Rome was crippled, its medicine was dead. Based on archaeological findings and manuscripts, we see a severe decline in their knowledge and application of remedies and treatments. Roman medics understood all sorts of maladies, how important preventive medicine and nutrition was. They had sanitation, anesthesia, and antiseptics, but the only thing they and every other pre-19th century civilization lacked was germ theory. While they had some defenses against bacteria, Rome was powerless in the face of smallpox. When the plague first hit, the medics were the first to throw themselves at the enemy, and within 2 decades, every teacher and student was gone. Without its healing factor, and 1/3 of its population wiped out, Rome decided to rely on Germanic mercenaries for its own defense. The old system of large legions and walls defending the empire was replaced with a more flexible, autonomous system, a system which would eventually morph into feudalism. The Black Death fundamentally changed European society, but I would argue that the Antonine Plague's effects were even more far-reaching. The empire was not really overexpanded until the plague. The rich elite, which acted as nobility participating in the war effort, decided to now use Germanic people for that role. It was the plague that transformed them into a caste with nothing better to do than dabble in corruption and power plays, often leading to just civil war. Rome dealt with invasions before, but after the plague, they opened their gates to the one group of people who hated them the most. Then handed them the keys and sword. Just 2 years after the outbreak, Germanic people crossed the Rhine for the first time since Lollius, the first time in 200 years. The amount of slaves actually decreased after the plague, since Rome was now on the back foot, which coupled with the labor shortages, crippled the economy. So why not just make that the point of divergence here? Why focus on Germany? Well, because while in our timeline, Germania became Western Rome's undoing, in this alternate scenario, its people would have been Roman citizens for generations. In this alternate timeline, the plague still hits, and it wipes out a third of the population. Marcus is succeeded by Commodus, the apple which catapulted itself far from the tree. However, while the Romans in our timeline had the great idea to open the floodgates to the Germanic chieftains for protection, in this timeline, there are no Germanic chieftains, at least ones that aren't in modern-day Poland or Scandinavia. In this alternate 165 AD, Germanic people speak Latin, they enjoy gladiatorial games, and they make up an imperial cornerstone. Much like in Gaul, the politics of centuries ago would be long forgotten. Things are still bad, of course, but recruiting German mercenaries just isn't on the table here. They haven't existed since the time of the first emperors. Even if Rome does decide to replicate it and hire foreign mercenaries, who do they invite? Picts? Arminians? Parthians? Apart from the Parthians, every major culture surrounding the empire in this timeline is either genocide or integrated. Compare this frontier to this frontier. Look at where the most subsequent invasions came from. The fact is, the Elbe River followed up by the Danube makes for a foolproof defense line. In my armchair alternate history strategist opinion, that is. Really putting on my Rome Total War thinking cap for this one. Now, the migrations would always have happened, because the Huns still would have happened. Much like plagues, random horse lord invasions are just kind of inevitable. And a lot of people would still slam up against Roman defenses, but now there are no antagonistic Germans to just let them in. The migrations simply sponge into the border, a border which is much easier to defend, and an empire which wasn't as weak or corrupted. This is no peak Rome, mind you, that state dies with the plague, but perhaps there's no crisis of the 3rd century here, and that could have been massive. Now, where the timeline goes from here is anybody's guess. When you're dealing with timelines that far back, with changes this impactful, the uncertainty factor goes through the roof. But one of the most interesting consequences of this scenario is that with the Angles and Saxons gone, you have no invasion of Roman Britannia. Would Constantine even need to move the capital under these conditions? How does a Christian and developed Germania affect things? Do the Huns focus on the east instead, leading to a timeline where the west remains a bastion, while Thrace, Anatolia, and maybe even Egypt fall? Does Western feudalism even develop in this timeline? Who knows? If you really enjoyed this, I could come back and see where things go from here. Before I go, thanks to all the patrons who support the channel, I really do appreciate it. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.